so much for coming out on a winter night. Woo! I know so many of you. Thank you. Children of people I've photographed, grandchildren of people that I've photographed. Thank you so much. This is a tribute to the Vermont old-timers who passed along values, something that we need so much still today, especially today. I'm going to read this. It takes about 4 minutes, and then I will do slides, and I won't use script. But I do want to read this because when I first came to Vermont in the 1950s, it was arguably one of the most rural states in the nation. The tiny population, larger only to Wyoming's, hovered around 350,000 people. That's like half of what it is today. A popular statistic, one that Vermonters seemed to relish back then, was that there were more than people. 11,000 family farms graced the landscape and dominated nearly all aspects of our daily lives. When one traveled by car before the interstate had been built, you judiciously left an extra 15 minutes for the cattle crossings of lovely Jerseys and Holsteins slowly ambling across the highways. Soon after graduating from Rollins College, I made Vermont my home, working as an elementary school teacher and later as deputy director of the Vermont Historical Society. This latter job allowed me to document the lives of a diverse section of Vermonters: farm wives, educators, politicians, hunters and trappers, blacksmiths, ministers, judges, justices of the peace, and the like. Not until the collecting endeavor had come to an end did I realize that every one of the documented was born and bred in Vermont. While I consciously didn't make a mental effort to note or exclude newcomers as candidates for the archives, I apparently intuited that those born and bred here were special and had a revered place in history. After 10 years with the Vermont Historical Society, I continued documenting the lives of these Vermonters on my own for the next 30 years. Each story was one of a kind. Some had been born as early as the 1880s and reminisced about gypsy wagon encampments at country fair time, old Civil War vets in long gray beards marching in parades, and farmers laying down their pitchforks to carry rifles in the Spanish-American War. From the very start of living and working in the Green Mountain State, I have pondered the virtues of men and women born and bred here, especially those who trace their bloodlines back 8 or 10 generations and who proudly state, "I'm a native Vermonter. My people came to these lands in the 1700s and stayed." Howes, Chittendens, Hastings, Coburns, Durkees, Dupree, Viennes, McFeeters, McAllisters, and those who came long, long before the First Nation people, the Abenakis, Abnakis, or the people of the Dawn. What might consensus say is the commonality of these people? What attributes were acquired by each generation and passed on? Did having to walk long miles to a one-room school or doing morning and evening chores build character? Did raising a large garden or supplementing the larder with a deer taken by a young marksman build self-reliance? Did going without a new pair of shoes or even an occasional meal in the Depression years instill toughness? Have the hard realities of living through the interminably long winters and seemingly never-ending mud seasons, let alone an October with snow outside, failed crops, and isolation at the end of a dirt road bring about a sense of sagacity, a deep sense of inner strength, surrender, and acceptance? What have their eyes and ears and hearts retained from knowing the sky, the rising and setting of the moon over the same mountain for a lifetime, a neighbor's gift of a cord of wood? What has our hauntingly beautiful landscape etched into their psyche? 100,000 people left Vermont between 1820 and 1900, finding it too cold, too wild, too difficult. Most of them immigrated to the rich, soft farmlands of the Midwest. Correspondence abounds between those who left and those who stayed behind. I've read hundreds of these letters. Quote, "Dear Grandpa, please come away from the rock and cold and played out soil of Vermont. Come out here to Iowa where the topsoil is 24 inches thick." 1859, last paragraph. Many quit Vermont, but most stayed on. Their children stayed on. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren stayed on as well. And a long line of tough, resourceful, energetic people came to be. Unique, straightforward, with an appealing matter-of-factness. They differ from any other I have ever met in America. Whenever I find them, I can tell who they are. They are Vermonters. And I intuit that the mountains and rivers, the seasons, breathe within them. We're Mattoons. We're Bradshaws. We're Gosses. Been around a long, long time here. They stand like granite on unwavering legs. They have poise. They have character. Now, can I take this? This is a neighbor who died a couple years ago. They called him Dude, but his real name was John Doyle. His people came from Ireland, and the Doyles are one of the 4 suits of the deck in the Chelsea area. John had a speech impediment. He was tongue-tied. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. He was a farmer, and he used to ride his workhorse way up to our fields, and he would bring in the cows. John had a cruddy old lawn swing, and I would sit there and we'd rock on this rusty old thing, and he would tell me things. One day he said, and the way he talked was hard to understand. John said to me, "Ethan, I got tear coming down my eye all the time. Take me an eye doctor." I said, "Well, I'd be happy to." So off we go, and we're riding in our car to Barrie, and he has to take a leak, and he doesn't hide too much from the road. Italians and Quebecois don't do it either. And he comes back into the car and he said, "Ethan, I don't know why I got tear all the time coming down my eye." I said, "I know why, John. You've been having too much sex with too much sex. It will do it to you every time." And John said, "Well, that be true, you ought to be blind." Theron Boyd lived in an ancestral home in Queechee. I think it's Hartford, I think it is, and 1785 house. And the developers at Queechee they poisoned his cows, and they stole furniture off his porch, and he never gave in. I went there, he was standing putting butter down the well sweep of his well to keep it cool. He served me a lunch of cold tongue, beet greens with a gravy on it, and switchel. And we talked. He was he had a thick accent. He would say, "Yeah, the wind is very sharp." He had a Connecticut River accent. Anyway, at all the fiddle and banjo contests in Craftsbury, the hippies had written a song called "The Ballad of Theron Boyd" about how he never, ever gave in. Ray Burke is from another planet. He was born in a tar paper shack in Granville, and he married Annie. He became blind. He's been blind for about 35 years. He used to be on the radio on WDV. He did the highway report with a great sense of aplomb and humor. And Ray milks cows blind, and he jitterbugs like no one I've ever seen before to like the Starline Rhythm Boys. He plays saxophone in a band. He uses chainsaws. They just bought 30 acres of new land. He doesn't know it very well. This is 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And he would go out there by himself with a chainsaw. He put one portable radio on one brush pile, one on another brush pile. He said, "I get my bearings that way." But he would cut pine and cedar, feel of it, and he cleared the land. It took him a couple months, but he did it. He's a hero in my life, a real hero. Chet. Huh? What's that? Oh, okay. Thank you. Chet Grimes lived not far from here in South Wheelock. It's a place that you wouldn't go if you weren't going. He lived in an old shack with his girlfriend, Helen, and he was a logger, quintessential Northeast Kingdom logger. He was a great logger. Controversial. Frank Foster didn't like him because he didn't feed his horses properly. Chet used to jump into rivers with his brother Temple in January just to see which one could stay in the longer. I used to bring him hamburger and bacon and kerosene and tea, coffee, and Helen and I and Chet would have an evening in the shack, and then it was too cold to drive all the way back, so I bunked down with the big horses in the shed, and at midnight, Chet would come out with a horse blanket and grain, and he'd put that blanket upon me. It was like a heavenly father doing so. Next. Josephine Young grew up in I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Shutesville. Shutesville or Shuteville? S? Which is it's a hamlet in Albany, up toward the mountain. She was a midwife and had a horse named Streeter, and she delivered she died at 96, and she lived with her daughter, and she would take her valise at 95, and on a hot summer day would try to get home, try to get back to her old life. And we'd have to go and take her back in. Tenny Call was a journalist for that Randolph Herald. He lived in a very poor shack with his handicapped son, Oakley, who loved being a comic in the Randolph 4th of July parade. Every time I saw Oakley, the boy, I'd say, "How you doing?" He'd say, "Oh, I'm percolating, I'm percolating." And he used that line for 40 years. I loved him. They did their laundry, and there was a sickly wife. They did their laundry on Wednesdays. I was at the Vermont Historical Society. I looked out the window. The high school boys stole his hat all the time, teasing him. I would have to go out, get the hat, push the boys away, and then they would say, "Well, have lunch with us." And we would eat in the bowels of the maintenance building with the hissing pipes. And they would share usually their applesauce and graham crackers, and I would share whatever I had. And Tenny Call, the old scribe, would read poems about nature and the value of friendship and what life was really all about. I'd love to get people together. I heard that my neighbor, John, John Doyle, you ought to be blind. John John had a friend, he says, Norm Fletcher. So I found out where he was, went and got him, brought them together. We go down to the diner in Chelsea. They order the blue plate special, and at dessert time, Norm says, "Christ, you remember we'd do haying with Bill Melvin down there? God, we'd have a whole case of beer in the front end of that farm-all tractor, and God, John, you got drunk really bad. We had to take you home and dump you like a sack of onions at your wife's feet, and she sassed you out good." So they're telling the story, and they're huge people, and the whole Chelsea diner is laughing. They're all with us, and the walls are laughing, and John's belly and Norm's belly is up against the table, and their lemon and meringue pies are jiggling. And I thought, God doesn't make people like this anymore. Romeo Beaudry. Paul, you knew Romeo. Lived on the Delano Road in Albany. This is a picture that reminds me of what, not Rembrandt, a Dutch painter, would have done. He's a French-Canadian, and he wouldn't talk a lot. He wanted to show me what he could do. So down on a winter's day, he takes me to the landing area where he has put up 2 cords of two cords of pulp, 4 foot long, not split, and stacked, which is a lot to do with an axe, with only an axe in one day. And so we go back to his house, and I start asking more questions, and he basically said, "I've told you, you've seen what I can do. You've seen what I can do." Donald Farr. Anyone know Donald Farr from Newport Center? At 95, went to a Boston Red Sox game with his neighbor, and the Red Sox management made a sign that said, "I'm 95, this is my first Red Sox game." He had never seen the ocean, never been on an elevator or an escalator, never, anyway, he loved it. And on the way home, he sat, according to the neighbor, on the edge of his seat. It was a huge, exciting day for him. And everyone asked him, "Oh, will you do it again when you turn 100? Forrest Belknap, heartthrob. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. He worked with Ricky Gutzman, and he was just a beautiful human being. French-Canadian, drank a lot, and he came up to my house in Craftsbury, said, he called me Wally. He said, "Wally, we got to go on a horse ride. Got to do it, spring day." And off we go. I have a white flea-bitten gray horse and a blue wagon, and off we go through Jim Patterson's field, down Ketchum Hill, out Creek Road, and it is gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. And I'm going, I got to get home. We got to pick up my boy at school. We go back to school. Forrest by now is really drunk, tobacco juice coming down his chest, and all of this. And my son is pretty conservative. He might have been wished that he could have been playing golf at the Stowe Country Club. And so Forrest comes in with my horse, and I'm sitting next to him, and I have long hair. I mean, that's bad enough with my son. And we come into the school, and Mrs. Marcus is there, and the horse starts rearing up, and Forrest says, "Hi-ho, Silver!" And my son, he's in 4th grade. My son looks at me. I can't do it very well, but he just shrinks. Is Erdine Gagne here tonight? Someone said there was a Gagne. No? Okay. 30 below zero. I don't know what road she lived on, but my car, B-Dub, should have had Elliot Morris there to fix it. My car seized up, and I had to run 3/4 of a mile to keep warm, knock on the door, and it's Erdine Gagne, and she's making pies for the Albany town meeting. Next. I met Dolph Sweeney's tonight. Sherry and I can't think of the other because I'm old. Sherry and say it. I can't hear. I can't hear. Anyway. Oh, this is not. Oh, I'm sorry. We're on Lynn Wheeler. Good. Excuse me. I try to keep an ear open for what is like a momentous small thing. And this was Lynn Wheeler's last day on the RFD mail carry that he had for 40 years. Your sister, Crystal, remembers him even in the early 50s. He did Macville, South Albany, South Walden, Little Hardwick, and he would bring the mail to your house. I don't know if you were old enough to remember him. Yeah, Crystal does. And he used a horse and wagon during mud season in the 50s. Lynn Wheeler, I was fascinated by, he took me the whole route. He said, "This is where I used to park my sleigh and let the February sun warm my shoulders." And then he told me how important it was to bring letters. He said, "I never got very far in school. I didn't get much of an education. But I think I've gotten in 40 years what people talk about. A death in the family, a letter. A marriage coming up, a letter. Someone coming to Greensboro Bend, picked me up a letter." And he said, "I was part of that community for 45 years. Next. I was at Ernie Wheeler's house this morning picking up chicken feet. A wonderful young hippie like me, a farming family, have meat and poultry. Ernie Wheeler lived 95 years in this house on East Hill in Plainfield. And he never went to Plainfield except in his horse and wagon or horse and sleigh. And he would say, "Why do you think that's so funny? My father only used those things, and my grandfather only used those things." The Goddard girls in the 70s loved Ernie Wheeler. They were from Brooklyn, and they just thought he was a cat's meow. This is Dolphus Sweeney. Dolphus Sweeney was a cedar oil maker from South Albany, as was his son, Dale, and others. And I saw great clouds of steam rising up. And I stopped and went into the forest, and there they were, something so very old. They reminded me of Thomas Hardy characters, like Under Greenwood Tree. They were soft, and they had a soft voice, and they were kind. And they taught me about cedar and where it was done. And anyway, when I came out of the experience, I thought, very few people today in Vermont really know the forest and what can be made or how you can cooperate with the forest, the treasures of the forest. Dolphin Sweeney, next. So Frank Foster was the greatest man I've ever known. And just, there's one of his children. When he died, about 6 years ago, I put away my camera and stopped driving the back roads because there was no one like Frank Foster. He had 11 or 12 children, took on 4 more one night, and kept taking people in with his wife, Ginny. Frank, I have to make sure the whole man. Frank had a sawmill, 320 acres. He knew every tree, the big trees on his property. This was a coffin that he made. He said, well, by Christ, he says, if I'm going to be in the ground, hell, I'm going to make myself comfortable. And I miss him dearly. They still get together, 47 Fosters. They're filled with the spirit of Ginny and Frank Foster. Next. Bob Hyde. Oh, I love this. Bob Hyde, East Bethel, studied electrical engineering at University of Vermont and was about to go into that profession, but each vacation around Christmas, he worked in the woods with his father and grandfather doing logging. And he realized how wonderful it was to be in the woods. And so he nixed the engineering thing and started his own business at a sawmill along the 3rd branch of the White River. I often think that his skin is the same as the texture of that weathered wood. Next. Bob Hyde. In Dan, I used to go to horse pulls, which were, it was kind of like a magnet. I often had a theory that men like this, and they all seem to really bond with each other, horsemen, horse-pulling men, trace, I bet it's just a theory that every one of their relatives, all the way back to King Arthur, kept big horses. I do. I do. Next. Bob Hyde, Georgia. Oh, this is my other favorite person. I knew him for 25 years in Waitsfield. He was the hired man at the Von Trapp farm. When Harry Smith was born in 1904 to Mary Mackay and Hezekiah Mackay from Ireland, he only weighed 2 pounds, and his mother put him in a shoebox with wool and put him in the warming oven of a Glenwood E stove. I would love to have seen that little kicking spirit, because at 55 years later, he was still spirited. He lived alone. He was prying out the last infected tooth of his mouth with a claw tooth hammer, threw it in the gutter and said, "Hi, I'm Harry Smith. Good to meet you." I just loved him. There was another shot, so I'll continue. Go. Danville Trapper. Marion Coburn. Her husband worked in the stone cutting sheds. They lived on West Hill in Chelsea. They had 13 children and many grandchildren. This is Damien. I said, Marion, and the house felt so comfortable. The smell of apples in boxes, the heat of the wood stove. I said, what kind of vacations? Oh, God, we never had vacations. We had a big old Chevy station wagon. We put all the kids in there and some neighbors, too. We'd go to a store and get hot dogs and buns and yellow mustard, and we'd just go out anywhere on the way to Williamstown Golf, and we'd make a fire, and we'd cook up the hot dogs, and that was our vacation. They were so full of love, this family. They all loved each other. Fred Metcalf was a farmer, and he hated being a farmer. He, he was a musician. For 54 years, he played the organ at the Norwich Congregational Church. And Fred planned his day so that he could escape, he'd milk early, and then he was a mile away from the great music hall of Dartmouth College. Less than a mile. And he would lope as a young man across the bridge and slink down into a chair and hear the great Bach fugue recitals. And then on the way home, with the moon shining on him, as he crossed the Connecticut River, those tunes stayed with him all night long. He did all the concerts there. Next. Okay, I love this story. This is Justin's father, and he's making the hinges for that coffin. He knew every tree on his property, 320 acres. He knew all the big trees, and he selected the big white pine and made the box, but he used hinges that he forged the hinges. Her funeral came first, Ginny Foster. They married when she was 16 or 17 and lived in Cabot. When she died, there was an open casket ceremony. And I talked to one of the children today, and they used to put, like, the body was open, or the top was off for a day down in the woodshed. And the children and grandchildren would slip things, just like the Egyptians, like Necco wafers and, into the coffin. Then the coffin was closed, and the next day they took it up in a pickup truck about a half a mile way up into the woods, big stone, where Frank had chiseled Virginia Foster, Frank Paquin Foster. We started life together. And there was a hole in the ground. All the family, there were 65 who came up through the woods weeping, and all the eulogies, we all wept, but nothing touched us more than when the six sons, and Frank, her husband, took the casket with horse reins and lowered Ginny Foster into the ground, your mother. She wore an apron all of her life, every day. There's a picture out there. I said to your brother, Mark, why did she always wear? He said, God, Ethan, it's as plain as the nose on your face. That's her uniform. She had 16 children there. That was her uniform. She'd go to a grocery store, come back, put her apron on. So the six sons and and his wife, and Frank, her husband, lower the casket with horse reins. It's a cold February day after all the eulogies, and the first shovelful, and all of us was stabbed to our heart. She sacrificed her life for every one of those children, all the time. And there she was. And the six sons are shoveling grit onto it, and the sound and sound and sound. And near the end, Frank Foster, her husband, either through mental telepathy or with his hand, do you remember this? Waves them away. And so those six men go away, and Frank finishes the job because she was his Ginny, and he would put her to rest. It was an incredible, the only other funeral, I don't mean to laugh, the only other funeral that was as good was Frank's 4 years later. Unbelievable. Okay, next. Ann Burke, Ray Burke, the blind man. This is his wife, Annie, who died at 95. She did everything from pumpkins to wreaths to eggs to pfeffers and blood. She's a farmer. She did sugaring at her Harvest Hill farm in Berlin. And I asked her at the end of her life, she was dying, I said, what's it all, how, she said, I used to look in the obituaries every day. She said this with a smile on her face. She said, I looked in the obituaries every day, hoping I'd see my name, because if I knew I was in the obituaries, I didn't have to do chores. Okay. Have any of you ever been to West Woodbury? What a remarkable, you would never, ever go there. Buffalo Mountain, Woodbury Mountain, it should be in, not Orleans, Lamoille County. It's in Washington County. It's Woodbury. And you have to go up Kate Brook Road. Anyone ever been up there? Oh my God, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Anyway, Glenn Duger and Roland Choquette. Roland brought up some beer on his birthday. Glenn lived alone in a tar paper shack, no insulation. Glenn liked to drink. Benny's at D. Chaparral, Ray and Lucy. Oh, we've got some people. Oh, me too. It was so much fun to drink, and I'm not a drinker per se, but boy, it was fun to drink in Hardwick in the 60s. In the 60s. He got drunk, as he often did, and his neighbor brought him home. It was like 18 below, and his shack, the fire had gone out, and he knew he was going to really be in trouble. He went to the cow shed where there were 2 cows with a blanket, and he lay between the cows and conked out. But in the middle of the night, the blanket fell off, and he froze 1 foot severely and had to have his toes amputated. I came with Roland a few months later, and Glenn said, "Christ," he says, "I ain't gonna do that shit again. I'm gonna get a Delco battery and an electric blanket." In 1815, I've seen the cemeteries. There's one in my hometown of Washington called the Bohannan Cemetery. Mother and father Whedon died with 4 children, all within 3 or 4 months of each other. In Indonesia, 5 volcanoes erupted in 1815 and 1816. And a circle of cloud like Mount St. Helens blew around the world, snuffing out the sun. And it's called in Vermont, 1816, and froze to death. And there were frosts in July and August. Many people starved. But the Fayers from North Calais, his great-great-great-grandfather had traded something for trace corn from the Abnaki Indians around that time. And because it was Indian corn or trace corn, it was not affected by the frost. So Roy and Ruth Fair had the strain of that fair. And if you buy Fedco seeds or Johnny's seeds, they talk about Roy Fair's Flint corn. Next. Oh, I love this man. Great man. Codfish Clough. Isn't that a great name? Charlie, you ought to get a new name. Codfish Clough used to go to the Miss Montpelier Diner. How many of you have ever been to the Miss Montpelier Diner? Tom Conlon used to take executives from outer state, executives for National Life, to Miss Montpelier for dinner. He was from Calais and Barrie, and all I'll say is that he would always say, "Have you had your second cup of coffee?" Because if you haven't, let's get right down to it. And he would say, he would point toward truth with a capital T and say something like, "Do you know that bluebirds mate for life?" Next. I love this picture. These are the Patrons. And Guy Patwin is right here. I'd never met you until a few minutes ago. But this is, help me out, it's Frank, Bernard, Louis, and... Huh? Henry. Henry was the name of your father. Your father's name was Henry. When Henry came down from Quebec in 1904 and lived in Hardwick, a pretty woman came down from Quebec named Rosa and lived in Hardwick in 1904. No, it was Louis, your grandfather, sorry. Louis came down in 1880. Had Henry marries Rosa, his mother. Rosa, his mother, had 16 children in 23 years. She lived 1 week shy of her 102nd birthday. She had, I think it was nine and seven, 9 boys, and doesn't matter. No. Okay, and the boys were all loggers. These are the Patton boys at the Barton Fair during the Lumberjack Festival. When I asked your brother about a month ago in his blacksmith shop, he's sitting on a turned up 5-gallon pail, and I said, "What was your mother like?" He said, "Well, God, Ethan, she'd cook for all 16 children, and she'd never take a bite until everyone was fed." I said, "Frank, what was she really like?" And he got up off that 5-gallon pail, and he simply said twice, "God, she were amazing. She were amazing." So the guy on the right was my neighbor for years in Chelsea. Had a beautiful farm, 9 or 10 cattle, Holsteins, clean as a whistle, big udder bags, and beautiful farm, small. Bill Melvin. And Bill Melvin loved to have people come by, and we loved it because it was like going to church. It was a communion. He had the bulk tank, and he would have fresh coffee, fresh donuts that his wife Donna made, and he would tell raunchy jokes, and we would have milk in our coffee, and the milk right from the cow, and it was so special to be around that bulk tank. This is Sumner Far from Corinth, and when I used to go to see my mother in Connecticut, go down country, come back through Hooterville, we call it Chelsea, and if the lights were still on, I thought, the world is still safe. Next. Orlando died only a few years ago. He was one of the little school had 11 Brahmins and 9 Gilmans, 2 families filling up the whole one-room schoolhouse in Chelsea. Orlando never had a car in his life. He had a wife, he had children, but he never had a car, never drove. He would ride his bike to Thetford and back to work in the slate quarries. And when we watched him in Chelsea for 30 years, he would ride his bike in all kinds of weather, all the seasons, and we would stop just almost like, wow, there goes Orlando. And he was like a rare bird on a bicycle. We loved him dearly. Next. Herb Gomes. How many of you knew Herb Gomes? Oh, look at this. Herb Gomes was from Greensboro, and he lived in kind of a cabin. He was kind of a rough man on the outside. I always thought he looked rough on the outside, but it was soft as butter on the inside. A beautiful man. Are we on Herb? We're on Herb. This is a month before he died. Mary Young came up from Skunk Hollow and simply put her head against his head. Herb took me logging on Bar Hill, slashing the fir and the spruce with a McCulloch chainsaw, and he worked so hard and fast, hard strokes, and then the sun went behind a cloud and the temperature plummeted, and we had to go back to his cabin, to the light in the window, and we come finally back to Herb's cabin, the hound dogs and the wind and the cold, and we go inside and there are like tractor lags on the floor and a chainsaw on the table. Oh, are we saying something about your household? And he cut up salt pork and fried it up and gave some pieces to the 2 hound dogs, opened up 2 cans of beans, broke out some beer, and he goes over to the thermometer and looks at it, and he groans. It's like 8 below zero or something. And I said, Herb, why do you keep at it? You're not making money. You're cold and beaten down. And he simply said, I like it too much. How could it be different? Fletcher and Hattie Brown under the mountain, beautiful part of the world, South Lincoln, looking back at Mount Abraham, one of the great ones in Vermont, Mount Abraham. And this is where they had their milk house for 53 years, right there. And so each day, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day, they looked at the snow, the sleet, the hoarfrost of the beautiful, their sacred mountain, Mount Abe. Next. Harry going trading. This is the other guy I love so much. And I had teepees on his land in the winter and summer, and he takes me trading one night. He uses the word trading. Do any of you remember, do you ever hear that word in Vermont? Christ, I got to go trading tonight. Did you ever hear trading? It's an old-fashioned term. He used to go down, he was born in 1904, so we would go down through the woods to go trading, and we'd come to the covered bridge. This was sugar bush. And so there were skiers and whatnot, and we go through the covered bridge, and Harry says, now, Hubbard, he called me Hubbard. He says, Hubbard, if you got to pee, this is where it is, because there ain't nothing across there but skiers. So he had a knot hole. I just love that he had, it's still there. And on the way back, we stopped and drank some Ballantine beer and watched the new moon and Jupiter on Scragg and Mount Alice. And I would sleep in his old house. I had a teepee, but when it was really cold, he would invite me in. He didn't have heat, so it would be really cold inside. We had mounds of buffalo blankets, and he would start a story. He'd say, well, Christ, he says, we were up on Palmer Hill back in 38. There's Carl Long and all of the people up there, and we were cutting a lot of ash and maple. And so he starts this story with a lamp, and the hoarfrost is coming up, and I'm exhausted. So I fall asleep, and an hour later I wake up, and he's still talking. Love this family. And I say this with reverence. I say this, anything. Harry's knothole with reverence. The Chases with 2 different ski boots, 2 different shoes on. I say it with reverence. These were true Appalachian people. And there are Appalachian towns in Vermont. It's not really connected to the Appalachians, but it is. And towns like Belvedere and Lincoln and Middlesex and Worcester are all Appalachian. And these are true Appalachian people. They didn't have a tractor. They did everything by hand. They had pitchforks and scythes. They were great. This is Eugene and Elroy. And I loved them dearly for 25 years. I used to go looking for UFOs because they knew about UFOs. And they would say, I went in there and said, you guys ever seen any UFOs up here? Well, by God, yes, didn't we, Ma? And he says, we seen a spaceship with 2 spacemen come out with rifles, and they looked at us and they flew away. That's true. Next. This is one of the First Nation people. This is John Sweetser from Waterbury. The Abnaki, or those with Abnaki blood, were under the radar in the 50s and 60s and 40s. And they were marginalized, and they couldn't really, you think there was stuff happening now in the world, there was stuff happening about Indians all through the 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way up. And John worked kind of around lakes and rivers in Vermont, and he made baskets, ash splint baskets. He said, I can make a living, not much of a living, I can make a living with a jackknife and an axe. And he'd put those baskets on his back and tramp from Waterbury to Waterbury Center to Stowe, around, over Elmore, Worcester, Middlesex. And you can still find those baskets with a distinctive S on the bottom of them. Next. Oh, there he is. 55 years later. This is Justin Foster from Greensboro Bend, Greensboro. Woo! I asked Justin what it was like to work in front of his father or his mother. I didn't know that she was a taskmaster too, but Justin said they both had a distinct way, a fierce way, their way, and they seemed to know, I've talked to your brother, that there was kind of one way that worked. And Justin is beloved in this community and works with many kinds of people in Greensboro, building things, taking care of properties. He's trusted and respected, and I know you got it from your mother and father. Next. Oh, there's Ginny Foster. Oh, God. I asked one of the children, I said, I can't get a good quote. She says, it's as plain as the nose. Did I say this? This apron. Did I talk about the apron? I did, okay. What am I going to do with Ginny? 1 second. How did we get to Ginny? We're not supposed to be there. See what's next. J. Richard Nye. I don't know how that picture got in there. J. Richard Nye lived in Berlin. He was a grave digger. He was a historian. He had a bicycle. He had a briefcase filled with papers, local history, Berlin history, and he'd wear cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, and he'd walk the Barry Montpelier Road, and I would videotape him, and he said, this farm was here, and the fish used to be good in here, Benjamin Falls was here, and the trolleys used to come up here. He says, of course, no one knows about Benjamin Falls. They think that's where Volkswagens go to rest when they sold out. I would love to have been at his graveside when he had delivered a eulogy, like something out of Shakespeare. Next. Glenn Sanborn was a harness maker from Chelsea. His father, Harry, had been a harness maker, and his son was a harness maker. And when you went in there, you talked about the speed of a horse going down Route 110, elm trees, 1928, and what it was like to travel with horses. Next. Oh, this is Albert. Albert Chase, this is the two boys, the two sons, the UFO guys. This is their father, who I respected. He had a hard life, but he was tough. He was tough. He was tough. He was tough. He was tough on the boys and tough on his wife, tough on himself. Oh, and the thing I want to share. I took Harry Smith, the one who weighed 2 pounds at birth, the knothole guy. I took Harry to meet the Chases because they both spoke the same language. They lived 20 miles apart but had never met. Harry lived in Waitsfield, Albert lived in Middlesex. I'd get them together. Nellie's made a chicken supper with gravy and mashed potatoes, and they fell in as if they were Rockefellers and Roosevelts. And they used words like thee, thine, 'twas, shan't, and they loved each other. They came from the same mold. Next. Here are the Chase brothers. Albert, the last, never allowed anything mechanized. Although when he died, Nellie went out the next day and bought a generator. She bought a tractor, and I said, what do you, and she got a TV with something. I said, well, what movie did you see? She said, and I say this with absolute, it's a beautiful movie. She said, we've seen something really good, Ethan. I said, what was your first movie of late? She said, it was Dumbo. Dumbo was had a beautiful message. She loved it. Next. The Ed Larkin, we only have three more slides. The Ed Larkin dancers, mostly from Tunbridge and Chelsea, were a product of a man in the 30s and 40s and 50s who was saving the tunes that came over on the boats. Like John Doyle, the guy who said, well, you ought to be blind. John Doyle, the first slide, could dance better than anyone in this room. Often you find a heavy man or woman, but a heavy man who had a lilt in his step, a lilt. And it's from that Irish stuff. It came right off the boat. And so for 30, 40, 50 years, the Ed Lonergan dancers have been doing these old schottisches and jigs and reels. Next. So Gerald Pease never married, he died a couple of years ago, and lived in Middlesex. He had a great sense of humor. I'd drive up, he'd be reading a book. I said, "Gerald, what are you reading?" He said, "I ain't reading, I'm talking to you." He lost his license. The state took it away because he couldn't see. So he defies them and drives a tractor all over, and he drives his tractor to the Shady Rill Church to start the fire in the winter so that the parishioners would have a warm church to come to. So here he is. I think you can see the big Hershey chocolate bar. It's about this big. He always ate one while the hour waiting for the people, and he said, "I'm talking to God while I eat my Hershey bar." Next, we have two more. Harry Thompson. There's a number of people here tonight who knew Harry Thompson. Harry Thompson was one of the great people on this planet. He married a hippie girl from Goddard late in life, and they had 4 children, and she left him, and it broke his heart. But he rebounded. He rebounded. And he was friends with your father. Harry Thompson, I went to his memorial funeral. Steve, you were there. And people got up and said, "Well, we never knew who left those bags of groceries on our porch." He was like a real Robin Hood, he was. He would go into his back, he sold junk. He sold anything, carburetors, globes for lanterns, and he would go in the back room, and with sincerity, he would say, "Now this belonged to my mother, and I want you to have it free." He was a gentle, gentle man. His brother, Dude, anyone knew Dude? We got a couple dudes. Anyway, a great, great man. Last slide. This is Tom West from Richford, a master violinist with Savannah Kittrell Mitchell. And I worked sometimes with the Vermont Folklife Center, and this is a project that I did for them called Master and Apprentice. And real quickly, Vermont Folklife Center is so hot. They are so caring, so professional. They've done 5,000 tape recordings, blah, blah, blah. And so this was just one of their wonderful activities. I'm going to bow out and not talk anymore. We have 6 minutes of really beautiful music donated by supreme guitarist, fiddler, Pete Sutherland, and it's to a handful of pictures that last not many more than 5 minutes. So just enjoy the last 5 minutes and Pete Sutherland's music.
person. 2 inches from your mouth.
Okay. Close. 2 inches. I got it. Told him I guess it'd be alright. So he took a whole slew of pictures. Then after he left, my mother called me into the house. Says, who the hell was that? He told me, I told her what his name was. Years later, I got the book in the mail. My mother was finally relieved.